We're joined now by the head of the UN Relief and Works Agency, Pierre Krähenbühl. Who are you appealing to, and are you getting any access at this point?
Well, I was last week in Damascus myself to make a series of proposals for expanded humanitarian access. The good news has been that we have had, and our teams have had over the last 7 days, regular access to neighborhoods that are in the immediate vicinity of Yarmouk, where displaced people from Yarmouk have arrived in the thousands, and we have been able not only to access them, but to support them. But of course, our immediate worry and alarm remains related to the fate of those who remain inside Yarmouk, and as your document just presented, these are people who have gone through a lot of suffering over the last couple of years. It has been the result of siege, it has been the result of a presence of armed groups inside and the suffering that that generated. And you're dealing here with a community that is extremely weakened already and now has to deal with this new tragedy. That is why we have called for immediate political action by the international community.
Yeah, and we're talking about a camp here that's been established for a very long time. I want to remind our viewers of what exactly we mean when we talk about Yarmouk. It was once home to the largest Palestinian refugee community in Syria, about 8 kilometers from Damascus city centre. The camp, roughly 2 square kilometers inside, with 4 hospitals and a number of schools. Some 160,000 refugees once lived there. I'm talking 2 decades now. About 18,000 remain, and the UN has been allowed little access to the camp to distribute aid. Many refugees there die of malnutrition, many women die in childbirth, and disease is rampant. There are so many people displaced, so much suffering in this conflict. Why has Yarmouk become such a focal point for observers and for fighters?
Well, I think, first of all, because it represents a tragedy on an epic scale within the wider Syrian disaster. And we know how much the Syrian conflict has brought and generated and created a catastrophe in human terms for Syrians, of course, but here also for Palestine refugees. And as you indicated, there were before the war 560,000 Palestine refugees in several camps inside Syria. Historically, they were welcome in the country, and they were very also engaged in socio-economic activities, largely self-sufficient. They would only send their children to UNRWA schools because they were free and of good quality. And so you have now a community that is 95% fully dependent on emergency humanitarian aid provided by the agency I lead and other agencies that are involved in supporting us. So it is clear that you are dealing here with people who have been extremely weakened. In my previous visit a month ago, I saw women collapsing, pregnant women collapsing in queues during distributions of assistance. One really has to take the measure of what this represents and the lack of prospects and hope for this community in the conflict in Syria. And of course, iconic pictures that came out a year ago of thousands of people coming out of the bombed homes and apartment buildings for the distributions, I think, are in everybody's mind and remind us that at the end of the day, conflicts are about human beings and the suffering inflicted on them.
You said at the beginning of this interview that you've been in Damascus trying to effort some sort of access to Yarmouk for the UN. Who are you talking to? Because at this point, it's Syrian military bombing what they believe, or they will say they believe, are ISIS and al-Nusra fighters, who are, of course, are opponents to the al-Assad regime. Are you getting anywhere with Damascus at this point? Because nobody else is.
No, it's very clear that this is the practice. When you have an armed conflict, and I've worked in armed conflicts for 25 years, you go and sit down with the key stakeholders, the actors. And of course, so I sat down with the deputy foreign minister in Damascus, put to him a number of proposals, and we reviewed those for continued access to Yarmouk itself. Very difficult right now because of the conflict dynamics, but we will continue to work on that because we're not an agency that gives up, and certainly not an agency that abandons people. people in such difficult circumstances, and also to request improved access to the areas in the neighborhoods that people have now fled to. This is something the government did agree to and has been supportive of, and so we have had access, and this is something to note. Of course, my experience also that this has to, of course, be expanded further and continued, which is something we will insist on, because you know, there is a link between this situation and your previous report on migration. I have met many people who have now the only prospect is to get on the boats and cross the Mediterranean, and believe it or not, there are people who have drowned in the Mediterranean who had survived the tragedy in Yarmouk, and this is almost beyond belief.
I don't want to complicate your work, because I know it's incredibly difficult and delicate. But I find it, and perhaps our viewers will find it, hard to believe when you say that you're getting help from the Syrian government here, because at the end of the day, the conflict is of the making of the Syrian government. You know, and if they wanted to help, they'd stop. They'd stop what they were doing, and they would allow these people to live a decent life again. So at the heart of the Syrian conflict is the Assad government. So I'm slightly confused, and perhaps our viewers will be, as to just who you talk to when you sort of pick up the phone to Damascus, as it were. I mean, how close are you to the Assad government when you are efforting access to such a desperate situation as this, and you say that you're getting the help that you need to a certain extent?
Well, you know, maybe it's the confusion just comes from the fact that the experience of working in armed conflict tells you that the only way to reach people in armed conflicts is actually to talk to actors on the ground. There's no other way. There isn't any space in it that you create for yourself without engaging with stakeholders. So the relationship between the agency that I represent and the Syrian government goes back many decades, because it all starts with Palestine refugees being forced from their original homes in the environment of Palestine, and having to flee to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and in other parts. And so, of course, we have been present there. And as I said earlier, the presence of Palestine refugees was supported historically by the Syrian government, and therefore we have a practice of engaging with this government. And of course, there are times where we disagree and where we raise issues that create irritations. And if I bring forward something of a request for better protection of Palestine refugees, we will have a discussion on that. But I have no problem saying that if a discussion and dialogue we had with the government leads, as it has in the last week, to improved access, that's a factual observation. If that were to change in coming days, I would come back to you and tell you that I regret that it has changed, and I wouldn't have any problem in saying that either. But right now, there has been progress on that. It is limited progress. It is not enough, but clearly we want to build on that.